Go softly in the breeze, in the clouds. I hear
Welcome to Stream Generale of the TU Delft and the Decolonising Knowledge lecture series. My name is Klaas van der Tempel. I'm here to introduce our guest today, Carolina Sánchez-De Jaegher. She's a philosopher, an ecofeminist scholar, and a researcher at both the University of Utrecht here in the Netherlands and the UC Louvain in France. Carolina has dedicated her academic work to environmental ethics and the theory of justice for nature. Together with us in the studio right now is my co-host Annelien Magielsen. She's a student of industrial ecology at the university, but she's off camera because of corona distancing. So she'll be switching places with me later to ask Carolina some questions. We'll also be joined in a Zoom video call by scholar Liisa-Rávná Finbog. She's a Sami archaeologist and scholar at the University of Oslo. So in today's presentation, we'll talk about the ethical and environmental problems created by sustainability practices around the world, and how indigenous activists and land protectors are resisting these practices. Now, I can already hear you thinking, wait, isn't sustainability supposed to help save the planet? Well, ideally, yes. But there are some shadow sides to the matter. So if the idea that the impact of sustainability might not be perfect makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, a bit of cognitive dissonance, I'd ask you to relax your mind and listen closely to what Carolina has to say today. Carolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Klaas. It is an honor to be here in the TU Delft Decolonizing series. And thanks particularly to Klaas and to Annelien for inviting me here today to talk with you. In this lecture, I will try to join the dots between sustainability, decolonization, and philosophy, and a very special type of philosophy, indigenous philosophies, and the struggles to save the territories and sacred places from extractivism, and more recently, from green capitalist investments embodied in wind energy, monocultures, and other projects. However, I have to start off by saying that I'm not an expert of this. Actually, it seems to me that the very word expertise is more effective in putting us apart rather than to join us together to work for better futures in plural. Decolonizing sustainability. I have thought a lot about it because it comes closer to some of the topics I know more about it as an environmental philosopher and legal philosopher. However, I have never put a presentation together specifically on this topic. So today is my first time. All in all, I think I have things to say about sustainability as an environmental philosopher. And it is from there that I will need this talk today. Sustainability and decolonization. These are buzzwords in education right now, especially as we plan ahead for a COVID-19 era. Everybody wants to decolonize. It is the buzzword in academic halls right now. As a consequence of the pandemic, our common house has benefited from significantly reduced pollution. And I do not know if there is a correlation with this in a scientific way. But the underground water levels here in the Netherlands, after 3 summers, they have achieved its normality. And we are enjoying pleasant temperatures at the moment. Such an anthropos has also led wildlife to re-enter habitats that now are suddenly available. This is a photo, a picture of a puma in Santiago in Chile, at the highest of the pandemic infections. And as the puma in Chile, many people in the world has witnessed that just a bit of rest for nature can help us to get back our common goods. So, when Klaas contacted me some months ago to discuss the possibility of giving this lecture, one of the things that popped up on this, in all this, was that Klaas, his wife, was a bit hesitant about the word sustainability in itself as the way that is going to save us all from drowning in the sea. And that first part of the conversation triggered the title of this lecture, Decolonising Sustainability. A second thing that popped up from our conversation was that to join the dots between philosophy, decolonization, and sustainability is a complex exercise that requires to review many of the assumptions that we have about sustainability and the narratives that underpin the concept and the actions after it. So therefore, in order to discuss decolonization, I will first start by tackling some assumptions about sustainability itself. Then I will review the idea of colonization, because I think it is important in order to understand the verb to decolonize and the noun decolonization, to first have a view on what colonization really means. Finally, we will engage in a decolonizing dialogue about sustainability here in the West. Because it is here in the West where we live, where we work, where we dream about better futures for our people, for our families, for our friends, and for the world. I hope that this lecture will stimulate your imagination, as it took a lot of effort to think critically about something that everybody, inclusive also myself, see as very important, highly important for the times in which we are living, as a consequence of our actions with our environment. So let me start by saying that decolonization is a concept that is profoundly territorial. So the verb to decolonize and the noun decolonization remains where we dwell. In other words, decolonization remains with ourselves as countries and with our particular stories, languages, friends, as individuals, as a society. And important in the ways that we exist with each other. With each other, I'm also including non-human life. To be critical about something that is widely considered as beneficial demands open dialogues and the demystification of many solutions that have been saw as the only ones available, as universal. In other words, in order to generate a concept that is decolonizing in sustainability, we should follow what Rolando Vázquez and Nelson Maldonado Torres said, envisioning a concept of sustainability that liberates instead of reproducing the causes that generated the environmental crisis in which we are living now. So that's one first step in the process of decolonization, in my view. Decolonizing sustainability implies to enter into dialogues with earth ethics, with the different earth ethics available around the world. And believe me, there are a lot of them. In our path of decolonizing sustainability, we also need to remove the assumption that indigenous people are opposed to clean energies. This might sound a contradiction, but it is not. Indigenous communities worldwide have been very involved in promoting clean energies in general. However, if indigenous people are keen of sustainable energies, one can ask why there are so many conflicts with these energies in indigenous territories. In our path of decolonizing sustainability, I think I should say that we also need to remove the essentializing way that we look at indigenous people. In a way, indigenous people are not the people of nature. It is true that indigenous worlds do not make themselves by the division between the human and the nature as here in the West. They do not constitute themselves by this divisory line. But we shouldn't put this burden to see them as people of nature, because that conceals the idea that in order to become a human, there is a social contract that needs to confirm this division line. In a way, one can say that we are all people of nature. And until now, I haven't met any human from different continents that do not need air, clean water, clean soils, the trees, the seasons, the sun, the river, the mountains, the sea, to feel happy and as a human. So, what is sustainability anyway? I have some research about this, and I found two important definitions that seems to be the most quoted. One is from the United Nations, so I'm going to read it for you. The most that is related to sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. And there is another one from the platform IPES that says a characteristic of a state whereby the needs of the present and local population can be met without compromising the ability of future generations or populations in other locations to meet their needs. These are important definitions because they speak about the present and the future availability of resources, and indeed they speak about only human needs. As nature could not have needs. So keep an eye on that. So what about if we think about sustainability in terms of earth ethics? How would it look like here in the West? I'm curious about it. In a report presented by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, it is stated that 80% of the biodiversity of the world and 40% of the protected areas with ecologically intact landscapes still exist in indigenous territories. An important point to make here, using the data, is that sustainability might not be the only game in town to fight climate change and the environmental crisis. So there is a part of the puzzle here that is missing. Certainly, if 80% of the world biodiversity still exists in indigenous territories, this cannot be attributed to an idea of sustainability as presented in the UN sections that we just read, where only human needs are counted, forgetting that nature also has its needs. How many of you, looking at this video, know these concepts? Do you have any idea of what they mean? If you don't, that is a norm. These are all concepts that are related to an idea of sustainability seen from indigenous worlds. But I have to be clear about this. These are not translations of sustainability from indigenous worlds. Like I said, sustainability does not really have a strong meaning in indigenous communities. All these concepts that you see here are related to a life in harmony and in coexistence with non-human life. These concepts are ancient ethical ruling principles of how to live and exist in the territory. And they do have a lot to do, as my colleague Liisa-Rávná will tell us later, with the use of the land, the prosperity, the wealth, the health systems of indigenous people. And most important, with the coexistence of all life in the territories. And this is something I do not see in the definitions of sustainability that I have been researching the last couple of weeks. I haven't found any ethical construction of sustainability. And in our path to decolonize sustainability, this is also another part missing in the puzzle of the whole story about sustainability. The relation of sustainability with an earth ethics marks for me the most crucial part and element to make from sustainability and sustainable energies a successful story that does not reproduce in another fashion the sources that have caused the environmental crisis. I would like to have the time to read and to go through all these concepts, but I'm just gonna say that sustainability is only one part of the whole amount of knowledge, infinite knowledge is available of how to exist in this world. And sustainability is one of them, and part of this whole branch of knowledges, but it's not the one, and definitely not the most important. The 80% of the biodiversity of the planet that is still present owned a lot of the concepts that we just saw to these indigenous ethical principles of the good life as they had been translated here in the West, and not without causing some misunderstandings. In this context, a second point toward the decolonization of sustainability could be the acknowledgement of our own ignorance, that many times is reproduced by the very educational curriculum that is supposed to teach us and provide us with the space to discuss these things. In my field, the presence of non-Western philosophies is almost absent in the curriculum. I'm talking about here in the Netherlands. Students do not really have a place where to discuss these things, these problems with sustainability and ethical principles. Indigenous philosophies and sciences are definitely not well represented in the curricula. And if sometimes they are represented, they are not represented by the people that have the knowledge to speak better and in a clear way about that. Many times these knowledges are an interpretation, a foreign interpretation of the very people that produce them and apply them in their territories. Why do we need to decolonize sustainability? So this is the most important question of the whole presentation. We need to decolonize sustainability because colonization is not something from the past. It is evolving. And a good example of this are the wind energy projects that are carried on many times without the permission of indigenous people in their territories. If we stick to the idea that colonization is the invasion of a group taking over the land and imposing their own culture on indigenous people, we should take into account that all these conflicts with clean energies in indigenous territories emerge under the same colonial logic that have ignored indigenous science, spiritualities, mode of life, and ethical systems. So not everything is to be used, not everything is to be consumed. Say indigenous people, the Mapuche people in Chile and Argentina. And in the picture here, there is a reference to a conflict with a multinational, wind energy multinational. This conflict took something like 10 years, a bit more than 10 years. So every time that the company started the works, then the Mapuche communities opposed to the further construction of this. And one day, the multinational disappeared, to the surprise of indigenous people. So when they went to the sacred site, what they found was destruction, the destruction of plants, medicinal plants, the machinery, and most importantly, the trees on the ground, very important trees that the Mapuche people worship, and they are very important as part of their spirituality. So the tree trunks lie on the floor, and they are still there. The plants, after almost 1 year, have started to come back. But the tree trunks are still on the ground, and they will never come back. And if they do, it will take something like 30 years to see this type of trees to grow in that territory again. And to see a tree, maybe more than 100 years, if they come back, because Mapuche people are not certain about it. So what was the motivation to leave the works in this wind park in the Mapuche territory? Money. Because there was such an opposition for the construction of these wind turbines, there was such a big opposition that every time that they started to work, then the Mapuche people came to the site, went to the police, and a whole process of fighting and fighting back lasted more than 10 years. Therefore, in order to make an effort to decolonize or for the decolonization of sustainability, we need to think what and to whom is sustainability serving? What are the marketing ideas that sustain it? We need to remember how to dialogue with transparency and bring an exercise of listening to what we do and why do we do that? What do we want to achieve with our actions? I think this is especially important and a very good idea after all we hear in the Netherlands nowadays. We need transparency and we need to come back to our senses. I guess the audience know the reference. Decolonizing sustainability implies to accepting multiple futures and the limitations of scientific knowledge. And this is very important in the solutions planned to fight climate change. You can have many wind turbines and many other technologies, but if the people is missing, I wonder how effective will these technologies be. Decolonizing sustainability is envisioning a concept, like I said before, that liberates instead of reproducing the causes that generated the environmental crisis. And this is important because if you look at the sponsor of every climate summit, you find the auto industry, the forestry industry, Coca-Cola, Walmart, Philips, L'Oreal, IKEA, they are all companies that have contributed a lot and deal and have a lot of responsibility of the situation that we are facing now. It doesn't look good. So one wonders how sustainability will generate the ethical transition that we need to secure life in the planet. And that's a big question I also have. These are indigenous people from the Sarayaco community. Actually, one of them is Felix, my friend, from the Ecuadorian Amazon forest. Can you guess where they are? In Paris, in the COP21. And they crafted this canoe to come to Paris by sea to protest about the lack of inclusion of people that see every day the destruction of their habitats, their homes, their spiritualities, their knowledges. It was a big surprise for Paris people to see indigenous people navigating in the most known river in the world. And actually, some people of this summit went out to see that. It was effective. Next to the conflicts with green energies in indigenous territories, we also have the green deserts, and that's the word that Mapuche people in Chile used to talk about monocultures. Monocultures of pine and eucalyptus. These trees consume every day more than 50 liters of water. And they have caused, after several decades of exploitation, a scarcity of water and hydro resources in areas that had been rich in rivers and lakes. Engineers in my country, water engineers, are really foreseeing that in no more than a couple of decennia, some rivers will disappear because of these monocultures. And God's sake, we don't have the soil for palm oil, because that could be another story to add to the history of monocultures and destruction of forests. I feel that I should say something about international aid. Do you know who this person is? She's Berta Cáceres, an indigenous leader that paid with her life the protection of the Gualcarque River in Honduras. This dam that the Honduran government wanted to build in the sacred place for the communities was done with the support of two important stakeholders for development: the Dutch Development Bank, FMO, and the Finnish Fund for Industrial Cooperation. So if we go further in our attempt to decolonize, I think that government and investors need to be aware of this. And if there is disagreement from indigenous communities for building a dam or a wind park, you need to hear to them. This space will provide you a platform for learning in mutual respect for a situation that will tackle us all. To finalize, I just want to say that the Netherlands have the ambition to become a leader in sustainability in the coming 30 years. A lot of investment has been done in science, technical, and engineering education to achieve these goals through academic levels and in detriment of humanities. However, the complexity and reality of the environmental crisis relegated to a scientific mathematical formula to rule the society has started to show unrecorded injustices here in the Netherlands. I guess the audience also know the reference. While a specific knowledge is required to build wind turbines, solar power, panels, and other technologies, the complexity of people's life and biodiversity and the environmental crisis cannot be reduced to the science and technology business model. We are in an ethical transition. Therefore, we need to re-exist sustainability. Re-existing sustainability needs to be in the company of an attitude for listening and education that generate lives, both an ethical transition for a world that has forgotten its ancestral relation with the territory. I have gone through some sustainability programs of important universities, and what caught my attention when I have gone through the brochures is that there is always a picture of a tree that grows above a pile of coins, golden coins, and money. The roots and the mycelia that sustain trees and life and forests are gone. And this is worrying because so far I know forests, trees, nature, life does not feed with money. Sustainability, as I said, do not have a strong meaning in indigenous community, but it does here. And it is here where the work of decolonization needs to be done. Not so long ago, the World Wide Fund Nature launched a report that stated that the rich economies of the EU, of the European Union, under which the Netherlands, are responsible of 80% of the deforestation of the world. If the Netherlands wants to become a leader in sustainability and really preserve the future of the generations that will have to inhabit this territory, decolonizing becomes the bridge for healing and creativity and also reciprocity and complementarity, two important principles of indigenous philosophies. Because what you take from your soil, you need to give back. We are all connected. We need to find healing in a broken world. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Carolina. I think before we go into the Q&A, we wanted to invite your extra guest, Sami scholar Liisa-Rávná Finbog, to join us in the conversation. So, Liisa-Rávná, if you're ready, then you can unmute yourself. And Carolina, maybe you'd like to ask her the first question.
I think that Lisa is going to present the situation with the wind turbines, the parks and wind energies, and the conflicts in the Sami with the Sami people in the Nordic countries, and also something about the philosophies of the Buen Vivir.
Yeah. So yes. So I live on the Norwegian side of the border, but my home territories are found both on the Swedish and the Norwegian side. So, but this is, technicalities. But because when we look at the issue that the Sami people are facing today, we need to be very aware of the fact that there are some differences because the national states that colonized Sapmi, the Sami homeland, have different policies. So there will be, of course, there is always differences, but I think the biggest issue today is this belief that there are empty spaces in the world, right? So this is very similar to the concept of terra nullius, which means nobody's land. And so empty spaces are areas that Sami people have used for generations, but you won't find structures there. You won't find, you won't find walls and fundaments in the ground, because the use has been very different than what is considered use in a Western judicial way or perspective. So You brought up this concept earlier, Birgiopmi, which, the good life. But, and that's, it doesn't technically mean the good life, but it is, in essence, what it means to have a good life, because it sort of encourages you to live in a way where you don't take what you don't need. And because of that, your needs will always be fulfilled. And I think what we see then is that these perceived empty spaces that are now being made into areas where you have windmill parks. These are areas that are in use, but without leaving visible traces. And this is basically what we see all over the world when we look at indigenous communities and their struggles and issues relating to extractive industries. That someone comes in and they look at the land and they see, well, there is no one's building anything here, so it's free of charge. We can just go in and take it. It's the same mentality that has ruled the process of imperialism and colonialism. That space is empty, it's not in use. Ergo, it's free for the taking. And this also introduced this other very vital critique of a Western way of viewing the world, that only humanity has subjective will, that only humanity needs to be taken into consideration. And that's just not the case in most indigenous societies, where everything has subjective will. It might not be, like René Descartes' idea of I think, therefore I am, but it is subjective will nonetheless. And this, I feel, is not acknowledged, recognized, or in any way validated in the Western judicial system that currently govern how property is handled, how extractive industries are organized. So yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in with some comments on that and just bring the discussion.
Yeah, well, about what Lisa says, because this there is indeed an issue with all this technology and ethical systems. And many times also with the way that these solutions are put through the nation state, that does not include visions, pluralistic visions of the people that live in the country. And when you start to do that, of course, you will have resistance, and definitely you will have resistance from indigenous people. I was following one presentation of the Sami people. As Liisa-Rávná said, there is not one group of Sami people. The Sami people is a big nation, and please correct me, Liisa-Rávná, if I'm wrong, but they are located in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. When I was young, I worked in Rovaniemi, and I met a quite considerable amount of Sami people that live in that area. And I could observe many practices and knowledges on the spot. And at that time, of course, there was much more space. And Sami people need the space because of the reindeer. And you have, when you have the reindeer, but there is also that with the reindeer, you have a lot of knowledges of the wind, orientation, knowledges of the landscape to move, the animals around, the seasons that allow you to move from one place to the other, so the Sami people knows when to move, where to move, and in a safe way. So with a lot of with this idea of all these wind parks, all that knowledge disappears. And it doesn't mean that it disappears only because I know more about the Mapuche culture. And when I was talking about those trees on the ground, I mean, those are not simple trees. If the trees are gone, some things of the people are also gone forever.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is this. So the Sami systems of knowledge or epistemologies are very much embedded knowledges in that they come from practices and collaborations with your surroundings and with each other. So of course, reindeer herding is one of the practices that I do, Dotsi. Reindeer herding is essential for the practice of Dotsi to continue. But we're seeing now that, there are regulations now on how and on how there used to be a time when we could slaughter the animals and then take what was needed, and this is slowly changing, and so that now animals have to be slaughtered within structures, and things are shifting very slowly, but they are shifting, meaning that the systems of knowledge also is adapting to better suit the rules and regulations that are put upon us. But I also think that these empty spaces that I was talking on earlier, a lot of them are grazing lands for reindeers. So, they are in use, but because of the lack of structures, Sami structures, visible signs, it's easy to consider it not important. So if we put a windmill park there, who's going to care? Well, we're going to care. The animals are going to care. And I think, Indigenous people are often told that we all need to contribute to better the environment, which is kind of ironic that the Indigenous peoples are expected to pay the price for the Western society's overuse of resources and damages from extractive industries. So it's this vicious circle, when in the past, it was this, well, the Indigenous people needs to make way for progress for Western society. And now it's become, well, the Indigenous people needs to make way for our continued, for a better future. If you want to have a future, then the Indigenous people needs to make way. So again, it's this idea of Indigenous people being like non-essential or stopping progress. And what we see is that actually it's the Indigenous people and the lands that they still have sovereignty on that has biodiversity. That's where you find the practices that best prevent climate change, that best ensures that we do have a future. And yet our value, our insights are dismissed. And this is how the colonial structures of Western society have built a system that continue the colonization. I mean, in essence, as long as you have Indigenous people, you have active colonialism. Yeah, that's not even my point of view. That's a fact that in order for there to be Indigenous people, there needs to be colonialism happening. And so today it happens, colonialism continues. It continues in ways that are disguised as, for the sake of progress, for the sake of environment, but it continues. Yeah. And it will most likely continue even when we're gone. So our descendants will basically struggle with those same issues.
Can I ask a question, Liisa-Rávná, for you and Carolina, both of you, about the struggle? I'd say we're still in a cultural transition, not just in the West, but in the entire world, to kind of embrace this idea of sustainability, which we're critiquing today, right? Activism, struggle, resistance. It's different for generally in the West for white people than it is for indigenous people. Can you say in essence, what does it mean, activism and resistance for an indigenous people?
Well, you can call it activism and resistance. We just call it life. This is, for us, it's not a matter of activism. I mean, for me, it's not a matter of being an activist when I go out and speak and I do my work. For me, it's basically, that's who I am. I was born into a political body. I was born into a body that could only exist because my parents resisted colonialism, because they resisted what the strategies that followed colonialism. So every indigenous person, no matter what they do, if they, it doesn't matter if you're an author or a scholar, or if you drive a bus or whatever you do, each day that you go out and live and is indigenous, that's an act. That's an act of activism, of resistance. So I think, when we talk about all of these issues, sustainability, activism, these are all concepts that are sort of defined from colonial structures, within colonial structures. And then they are placed upon different aspects. I don't recognize myself as being an activist. I'm often called an activist. I'm often called, I'm very often people tell me that you're so critical to everything. And for me, I get surprised every time people say to me that, oh, you're an activist or you're so critical, because no, I'm not. I don't think of myself as being an activist. I don't think of myself as being critical. I think of myself as a person that sees a problem and gives voice, trying to, create a solution or try and give voice to all of the different aspects of that problem. That's not being an activist. That's not being critical. It's just the way it is. But I don't get to define myself. I'm being defined by everyone else as something that I don't recognize myself as being as. And this is the life that every indigenous person lives in. This is how we are treated even today. So power of definition still lies with the colonial structures. And so definition is still placed upon us. And I think this is reflected also in how the different nation states treat indigenous people, in how they, work with extractive industries. Just recently, we had a case here on the Norwegian side of the border where a local South Sami community went to court because a lot of the land areas they used for reindeer grazing land had been appropriated to create windmill parks. Now, the community won that case, and they were awarded 90 million Norwegian crowns in recompense, right? Which is, we don't want monetary recompense. What we want is our lands. But what the government then did when the company decided to appeal, the government of Norway then decided that they needed to offer the general attorney to the industry, to the company, because if not, we would sort of scare away all of the potential future companies that would find Norway a suitable place for extractive industries. Right? Yeah. So the government actually gave their attorney general to the legal counsel of the company. And that's, to me, that's completely shocking. It shouldn't be really, because we know how the situation is for Indigenous people. But honestly, that just goes to show how everything is, that just goes to show how things are in the world. And so the new way of colonialism that's happening today is extractive industries. It's a continuation. So no longer is Cook coming over the seas and discovering uncharted waters and islands. Now it's the business, the big money that are coming in and taking more of the land. And they do it with the approval of the governments. And that's probably a very critical way of putting it, but it's in this case, I think it's needed.
Yeah. And in the context of what Liisa-Rávná just said, in that context, you can still consider sustainable energies as a kind of extractivism. So they also belong to that corner, and unfortunately, that's the way it is, and that's the reason that here in the West, it is very important that we decolonize these conceptualizations.
Thank you for that good answer. Liisa-Rávná, what you said about, we know how things are, but actually I feel that maybe we don't. This is a topic that a lot of people, at least in my bubble that I live in, are not fully aware of. But for the sake of time, I'm going to cede my position to Anne Lynn so that she can ask some questions as well.
Yes, thank you, Carolina and Lisa. Maybe I can start with tap into what Klaas was saying. Right now, you see that people and institutions are finally tuning in the needs for more sustainability. How can they now also deal with the implications of decolonization? What's your perspective on that? Maybe I start with you, Carolina.
How can they deal? Wow, that's a complex question, because most of the people sometimes they really close their ears to do that. But there are some signs that there are openings, at least here in the Netherlands, more and more. There is a lot of pressure to open decolonizing studies, coloniality, the school of decoloniality that it takes every summer here place. And how can they do that? Well, sustainable energy is important and should be accessible for everybody. But the thing is that sometimes sustainable energy doesn't go along with aesthetics. I just point you one example. I went to one important library of a university, not this one, some months ago. I went in and something in my body sensed something that I didn't like, and I just couldn't locate that at the first moment. And while I was working there and I started to look around, I'm a kind of a person that likes observation, and all the walls around of that library were in black. Concrete, big walls. And I started to look for life, apart of the humans that were in the library. I mean, a tree. And I found one, but I was thinking, I was really suspecting, I couldn't get closer, but I was really suspecting that tree was made of plastic. So there was no invitation in the design of industrial design in that library, and it has the most expensive equipment inside. It was, you just cannot believe, but there was something missing, the human missing, the nature missing. And I was thinking, okay, is this an invitation to creativity? Because it doesn't look like, I don't feel comfortable here. It invites to other things. It invites probably in thousands of years more robots instead of humans. But this is not a library for people that will use human creativity in the future. I like to go to, when it was possible, to Spain. And I visited La Alhambra many times with my family. At the time that the Alhambra was constructed, of course, there was not the technology that you have here. But Arab people were very, very conscious about the possibilities that Earth provides us to build things. And people have problems in Granada because it's very warm and it has 30 degrees, more than 35 degrees sometimes, and even 40. But when you go to the passages of La Alhambra in Granada, sometimes you feel natural, very cool air coming from the mountains and from the rivers. So these people use all what the earth could give us to construct something that is fully sustainable. And 1,500, more than 600, and I think it's more. The Alhambra is older. So that's what I'm missing here in the West, the complementarity and the reciprocity principles that I have learned in my private life since I was a child, of building something with the earth and as humans. I miss that in design, from Western design.
I think, first of all, when we talk about decolonization, we need to be very aware that we are talking about a process happening within colonial structures. So we need to center what it is that we want to see happen. My personal opinion is that solutions to a problem can never come from the place that created the problem. They need to come from elsewhere. So I'm very conscious of the fact that these Western institutions, these colonial institutions, far too few of them have spaces, at least in Europe, has created spaces for indigenous, people, or they've not really created indigenous spaces, but that really needs to happen. So art institutions, they need to open space for indigenous curators. Universities, they need to open spaces for indigenous scholars that can come in and teach on the foundation of their epistemologies and methodologies. And I think, so we really need to understand that we are talking about two very different things. On the one hand, we're talking about decolonization. That is the job that needs to be done within the colonial structures. And then we're talking about indigenization. And that's the job that we indigenous people can do when we come in and create spaces where we open for other ways of understanding the world, other ways of teaching and learning. Yeah. And I think that's really, really important. So, yeah.
The worst case I have seen is in the field of philosophy. I have checked the curriculum of philosophy of many universities, and there is no presence of, let's start for them, feminism. Less for non-Western philosophies. There is the history of Western philosophy and the history of Western science philosophy. The activity of philosophizing and thinking and conceptualizing could be only an activity that belongs to white old men here in Europe. Mm-hmm. So what I profoundly agree with Liisa-Rávná, and in order to decolonize indigenous voices and non-Western voices should be more present in different stages of the colonial institutions in where we are all immersed, because the university is a colonial institution. It has its foundation in coloniality.
And can you say then, in a way, that the West is underdeveloped in terms of environmental ethics?
The West?
Or the Western countries?
Shall I leave it to you, Liisa-Rávná?
Well, I would say that the problem with well, with the West as a concept, as an idea, as an ideology, is that it leaves no room for everything else. And that's because, the very basic foundation of the West can only be supported by marginalizing or dismissing other aspects. So, and I see very often, when you have like these debates or discussions on decolonization, especially at the university where I worked, then you will always have these certain types coming in that argue that, but there's no, what do we need to decolonize? Norway is not a colonizing nation. We have never gone into the world and colonized. Well, no, you didn't have to go that long. Your journey was much shorter than, say, Britain's journey to Australia to colonize. But colonization still happened. I think we've become so accustomed to the way the system is established that it's difficult to sort of recognize everything that's wrong. Even for my part, when I was young, I had experiences. For instance, this one time I went to a museum here in Oslo with my school to look at an exhibition on Sami culture. I was so uncomfortable. I was so scared and alienated at the exhibition because it very much shook my world, because it displays a stereotype, a colonial narration of what the Sami was supposed to be. And I didn't recognize myself in that narrative. So my security as being a person of Sami, being a Sami person was completely shattered for a time. And I think, it takes, even indigenous people had to go through this process where they learn to recognize what is really wrong. Why do we react in this way? And that can be a very long and hard journey. And it's even more hard when you have to do that journey within systems that continue to oppress indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. So do I have a perfect answer? No, of course not. I don't think there really isn't a perfect answer. What I do think needs to happen is that Western scholars, that Western institutions begin to listen. And not only in the sense that, well, now I've heard what you say, and now I'm still going to go back and do it my way. You need to listen, and then you need to make a commitment to honor that exchange of knowledge, and to take it with you and try to implement it, as you can do. But at the same time, I recognize that it's very difficult to get institutions to do this. So then the responsibility what a non-Indigenous scholar, for instance, in academia can do is what's happened here, that you create space for Indigenous scholars to come in. So, Carolina being invited to do this and then deciding, I'm going to ask Liisa-Rávná if she can come in and join. So I'm going to, this space that I've been offered, I'm going to open it and include. That's what non-Indigenous scholars can do. And the same applies in every sense of the word. So, if you're at an art institution and there is this project and funding to put up an exhibition of Indigenous art, then fine, invite an Indigenous curator in to do that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's not about, it's about being an ally, not only performative allyship. Like it's about being an ally and actually committing to acting with your privilege to open the door for others. That's what you can do to decolonize.
I agree with Liisa-Rávná. Inclusion is an issue, and it's an issue here in the Netherlands. But it's not an inclusion of putting also some names in the curricula and the literature review of a course, at least in the academia, which is a place that I know more. because decolonization is not an add-in of the curriculum. It implies, and I think that class was talking about, but what do we do with all the knowledge that decolonization offers us, with all this critique? What do we do with this? It doesn't look good for us, for anybody in the future. And what do we do with all this pain? I think that once you have decided to know, you have to live with the pain. And once you know, you need to move forward. You need to act from your own positionality, from your own privileges, from your own history. And I think that Annelien was also asking about, but how can you have some humor about all this? And I say, Annelien, do you like cakes?
Yes.
So I said something to my students sometimes: don't never forget to bake the cake. If you feel in distress with all the knowledge that you get from decolonization, we have to continue. We have to be thankful for the air that we are breathing, from the landscapes that we are enjoying, from the sun that we are still profiting from the trees in your street. And perhaps in the morning when you see your friends say, "I decolonize, good morning."
Do you have some examples of good sustainability? For now, I will use sustainability. Like, is there an example you want to show?
Like I said in the presentation, there are no one ways of understanding sustainability, and for me, what is missing here is in the West. I'm not going to talk about indigenous philosophies, because that's another issue, and it will require much more time and probably much more presence of indigenous communities. That would be wonderful for another talk with Liisa-Rávná and perhaps people from the Ecuadorian rainforest. But in the West, there is something that is growing, and it's called regenerative justice. And these are people that are working with the regeneration of places that have been very damaged due to industrial activity. So that's a good example. From the Mapuche people, I have many. And I remember one of my childhood. The salutation of the trees. And many children in Chile will learn to salute the tree so that the tree doesn't damage us. And there is one that is called the litre. And if you forget to salute the tree and show the tree respect, then the tree will give you some allergy. And when I was a child, one friend of mine of the village forgot to salute the tree. And the next day, she had allergy. And I was so happy in my bed thinking, I didn't forget to salute the tree and I don't have allergy. And the tree saw that. So my respect for trees, really, it grew out of the school, out of the academia. And in that sense, to see a tree as a living thing. Yes? And another example is the way that implies indigenous Mapuche scientific knowledge. When they build something, they build a house, or they need to use a space, there is a whole ceremony to thank and to ask the place and the living things that are there, of the life that is there, the non-human, for respect and for help, to allow them to build that house or something else in that place. So in that way, children grow up with certain consciousness about this, about the space. And I do not know, Lisa, if you can add to that from the Sami nation.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking like a lot when you were talking and the discussions now about this idea that this code of ethics that you find in so many different indigenous communities. It has various names, but in my mother's community, it's called golmendahka, and it basically means reciprocity in all our relations. So it's an indication that everything is interrelated. So whatever you do affects everything else, and whatever someone else do affect you as well. And for me, as you've been pointing out in your talk previously, sustainability is really not a concept that I adhere to. I, to a much larger degree, support myself on Sami concepts, what we have in our ontologies and epistemologies. But I think this golmendahki can very much be referred to as a duty of care. And that is something I think does not need to be unique to indigenous teachings. I think the idea of having a duty of care, so you have a duty to care for the entire world, not only yourself. I think that is something that I would very much like to see be implemented to a much larger degree. And I think in some ways, through, I think for many non-Indigenous, from a Western point of view, though they don't articulate it as such, I think their perspective on sustainability might in many ways be similar to this idea of a duty of care. If they, implement sustainability and they actually believe it and live it, but if you only have it as a buzzword, then, what's the use? So, but yeah, I think I see a lot of non-Indigenous scholars now working with these kind of concepts and ideas, and that gives some hope for the future. We're certainly not there yet, but it's not all hopeless, maybe. I hope so, anyway.
Thank you so much. Because of the time, I will give the floor back to Klaas. But I'm really thankful that you would spend time here to talk with us about decolonizing sustainability. Klaas, the floor is for you.
Thank you, Annelien. Like Annelien said, we have run out of the time for today's talk. I do want to thank Carolina for being here today. And of course, Liisa-Rávná for joining us. Very valuable contribution to our discussion today, but also to the rest of the series. It's a voice that we've actually honestly missed so far. And in that sense, I want to talk to the people at home who are watching this on YouTube as well. Thank you for your attention. And if you want to know more about this topic, of course, you can search the internets, but I'd invite you to look at the rest of our YouTube recordings as well on the Decolonising Knowledge series so far. You can also find more on our program on sg.tudelft.nl. Thank you for watching.